Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about domestic policies during the 1940s and 50s. So, if you would like to follow along, this is just the Truman and Eisenhower domestic policies PowerPoint. Okay, so despite being thrust unexpectedly into the presidency, Truman intends to be his own man, not just a placeholder, for the next president or just in the shadows of FDR. In mid-September 1945, he calls for an expansion of the New Deal, which earlier in one of FDR's State of the Union addresses, he had called for an economic bill of rights. So kind of updating what the Americans think of as their, rights from the government or from nature. Um, some of these rights that FDR had wanted were the rights to useful and remunerative job, good housing, adequate medical care, protection from economic fears of old age, and a good education. And a lot of people are worried after World War II. Will the Great Depression return? Remember, you've got over 10 million men who have been off fighting in Europe and the Pacific, and all of a sudden they're going to come back home and be in the job market. So a lot of people worry about the Great Depression returning. In 1945, the Americans expected the Axis powers to be defeated, so they start planning for demobilization. Um, so, over 10 million people are going to come back home and need a job. This requires a lot of planning. Um, and their planners weren't quite ready for the war to end as soon as it did. The atomic bomb ends the war quickly. So, all those men coming home are going to come home a lot sooner than people thought. The Great Depression does not return. So that's good news for the American economy and the American people, but there's other problems. There's a lot of inflation. Americans had saved a lot of their money during World War II. World War II was good for the economy. Wages go up, production goes up. So basically, after the war, consumers, the American people, start spending their money. It was not seen as good to lavishly spend during the war because everyone's kind of in this together. But after the war is over, people start spending money again. Strikes return, so you've got inflation, you've got strikes. During the war, there was a no strike pledge, but afterwards that comes to an end. Truman's kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes he gave the strikers what they wanted. Other times he resisted the demands of the unions. In one strike, he actually threatened to strike the drafters into the army to kind of shut the strike down. And because he stood up to the unions, the strike ended up coming to an end. Um, the Employment Act of 1946 established a Council of Economic Advisors, which kind of implemented the Keynesian idea that the government's role during the economic slow turns is to prime the pump. Remember how we talked about the New Deal, saw the government as priming the pump? Well, that idea continues on into the post New Deal era. Now, despite Truman's presidency and some of the things he does, World War II ending, the Republicans gained back control of Congress in 1946. It had been a long time that the Republicans had been out of political power, so they get the House back. They passed something called the Taft-Hartley Act, which is seen as a big strike to labor unions. They don't get rid of, a lot of the gains made by labor unions, but they trim them back some, I guess you could say. They overhauled the National Labor Relations Act. Uh, it deals what Republicans saw as abuses by the unions, such as a secondary boycott, national strikes, unionizing of supervising employees. Section 14B allowed states to pass right to work laws, so you don't have to join a union. Truman vetoes the bill, but Congress overrides his veto. Now, Truman's reelection does not seem likely. He's going to run for election in 1948. I guess I should say election because remember, he wasn't elected as president. He was vice president when FDR died. Thomas Dewey, who ran against FDR, is now going to run against um, Harry Truman. And I got some political cartoons on slide 6. You can kind of see how people of the day did not think Truman would win. There was a famous saying during the time, to err is Truman. The Democratic Party ends up splitting in the 1948 election. You've got Democrats supporting Truman. You've got the left-leaning progressive part of the party supporting Henry Wallace, the other former vice president. You've got a group known as the Dixiecrats. These are led by Strom Thurmond. Basically, the Dixiecrats are not in favor of civil rights for blacks, and a lot of the Democratic Party isn't. But these are specifically the ones that will bolt the party if they see any Democrats as being too friendly towards civil rights. Like I said, the Republicans run Thomas Dewey, but Truman goes around speaking. He campaigns very hard. He attacks the Congress, the Republican Congress, as a do-nothing Congress. He wins 49% of the vote and wins the presidency. The Democrats win back Congress. If you look at slide 8, there's a famous newspaper headline that says Dewey defeats Truman. So everybody expected Truman to lose, but he ended up winning. In his 1949 State of the Union address, he called for a fair deal for the American people. This included national health insurance, education, housing, expansion of Social Security. When Social Security is started during the New Deal, it doesn't cover all workers. It only covers a portion of the American workforce. So over time, the Democrats are going to constantly be trying to expand Social Security to cover other groups of people. He wants a higher minimum wage and aid to agriculture. Um, they do pass the National Housing Act in 1949, but a lot of the other things Truman doesn't get accomplished. Truman does take some strides towards giving civil rights to blacks, so he kind of goes against his party in this. Truman's not great on civil rights though, but he's better than what the normal Democrat is. He appoints a National Civil Rights Commission in the mid 1940s. Basically, this commission called on federal intervention for civil rights. He does desegregate the military through an executive order, Executive Order 9981. Now, just because he issues this doesn't mean the military is going to be desegregated right away. Eisenhower is actually going to force all the desegregation to occur. So a lot of the things that Truman tried or kind of went half-heartedly on regarding civil rights, Eisenhower actually picks up and goes really far with civil rights. Now, there is something that goes on in the late 40s and early 50s. We have a second Red Scare in American history. And basically, what happens is there are a lot of communist spies in the American government as advisors to FDR, working for the State Department. There are spies on the Manhattan Project. We're starting to get into the Cold War, so there are spies and there are secrets being passed along to the Soviet Union. Elizabeth Bentley, she was the communist spy who defects in 1945, and she lists more than 100 others who are communist spies. There are other people. Harry Dexter White was a senior official in the Treasury Department. Lachlan Curry was an economic advisor to FDR. Alger Hiss worked in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He worked in the State Department. He was at some of the conferences with FDR when he's talking foreign policy during World War II in Europe. So there's a lot of people that advised FDR, made decisions on foreign policy. There's a lot of these advisors that are secretly communists who oversee policy over the Chinese Civil War. Who should America support? Should we support Chiang Kai-shek, the anti-communist, or Mao, the communist? Some of these advisors pull back some of FDR's support for the anti-communists because they want the communists to win. So there is a problem with Soviet espionage. Klaus Fuchs is a Soviet spy who worked at Los Alamos, and he gives some atomic secrets to the Soviets. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are caught spying for the Soviets. So basically, you do have spying going on. And if you think about it, especially with the atomic bomb, the Korean War kind of started because Stalin finally had the atomic bomb, and he felt comfortable that he could, go toe-to-toe with the United States now that he had the atomic weapon. He couldn't be blackmailed with atomic warfare because he had an atomic weapon now. Though the Soviets would have gotten a bomb without spies, but they got the bomb earlier because of the spies in the Manhattan Project. So you could argue that the spies helped kind of create the maybe they didn't cause the Korean War, but they created a situation where it occurred when it did. There is a famous committee, or infamous, kind of depending on your views, in Congress, the House Un-American Activities Committee. It's called HUAC for short. It's formed in the 1930s by the Democrats to root out Nazi subversion. Martin Dies from Texas. He's a Texas congressman. He oversees this group. But in the 1940s and 50s, after the Nazis are no longer a threat, this committee is used to look out for communists in American society. Now, FDR and Truman are constantly told about security risks, people who advise them who have communist leanings or are suspected communist spies. But FDR and Truman generally ignore these warnings, especially Truman. He's kind of seen as soft on communism at home. Um, the most famous of these cases, or kind of communist spying cases, is the Hiss-Chambers case. There's two men, Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers. They're both communists. Alger Hiss is, if you look at slide 15, he's the man on the right. He's a very handsome, he's a Ivy League educated person, very smart. He works in the New Deal. He's an advisor to FDR. He, according to the guy on the left, Whittaker Chambers, passed government documents to Chambers as a communist spy. So they're both communists. Whittaker Chambers has this really kind of interesting life where he has an epiphany and he becomes kind of one of the biggest anti-communist crusaders in the early Cold War. So Chambers has kind of a change of heart, quits being a communist, and then he reports who the communists are who helped him spy. He says Hiss is a spy. There's a big case. Hiss has to go before Congress. Truman does not believe Whittaker Chambers. Truman actually believes Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss always denied being a communist. Denies that he even knows who Whittaker Chambers is. It's a huge national case. Richard Nixon is one of the main people that believes Whittaker Chambers, and he and Whittaker Chambers eventually bring down Alger Hiss. You know, he was a spy. He ends up going to jail for perjury, not for spying, though. So there's kind of some big cases in the 1940s and 50s. Probably the most famous, or again infamous, kind of person associated with the Red Scare is Joseph McCarthy. He's often portrayed as the greatest symbol of the Red Scare. He gets an ism coined after his name, McCarthyism. McCarthyism just means you blindly smear or accuse individuals of disloyalty. You know, you smear them with no proof. McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin. He's a very big anti-communist crusader. He made accusations that there were communists working in the State Department and other parts of the federal government. He came to prominence in 1950 when he gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, that basically said there are communists in the State Department. And he's kind of been the poster boy for the Red Scare. Even textbooks today, every textbook criticizes him or casts him as this kind of dark figure. I got a quote on slide 16 from a book about McCarthy. Mostly every book about McCarthy casts him as kind of this dark figure that harms American society. Now, McCarthy was actually right about a lot of the communist subversion going on in the federal government. That was happening. He may have gone too far. He didn't ruin hundreds of lives. That's often how he's portrayed, as he just goes out and ruins everyone's life. That's not true. He actually early on would not name names because he said he didn't want to ruin an innocent person's life until they'd been proven of this. But, you know, you have the right to a fair trial, you know, when you're accused of a crime. But when you work for the federal government, especially in something that requires a security clearance, like, you don't have the right to have a job until you're proven a spy. Like, if there's even a whiff of you being a spy or sympathetic to America's enemies, like, you don't have a right to have that job. So McCarthy, you know, probably went too far eventually. He does accuse George C. Marshall, the great World War II general and Secretary of State, of being kind of a communist dupe. In 1954, there's something called the Army McCarthy hearings. McCarthy said there were communists in the Army. McCarthy goes too far. These hearings are televised, and the public kind of turns against him. Eventually, the Senate censures him, and he kind of dies in obscurity a few years later. Now, Truman does adopt a loyalty oath program. He makes you take a loyalty oath to not, you know, be against the United States. So Truman kind of saw the need for this too eventually. Much of Truman's second term is engulfed in the Korean War, and he decides not to run for re-election, which would have been his second time being elected, but it would have been basically his third term. Now, Eisenhower runs for president, and actually nobody knows whether he's a Republican or Democrat. Eisenhower didn't vote in any previous election. He basically says, since I'm a soldier, I need to be apolitical. I listen to the civilian government. That's how our republic works. So both Democrats and Republicans, both parties try to get him to run as their presidential candidate. But when they do that, he says, well, I am a Republican. So he runs with Richard Nixon as his vice presidential candidate. They run against Adlai Stevenson. Um, Eisenhower runs on basically three issues: Korea, communism, and corruption. Eisenhower easily wins election. If you can see slide 21, huge electoral majority. He even picks off some of the southern states, which, like I said, the southern states always vote Democrat because they support segregation. But Eisenhower is going to be a big supporter of civil rights. Eisenhower is seen as a moderate Republican. He's not going to roll back the New Deal. There's a lot of Republicans that want the New Deal to be erased. Eisenhower says, no, the New Deal is here to stay, but let's manage it in the most efficient way we can. So the Democrats will be too crazy with the New Deal. They'll shovel out too much money. Let's keep it, but let's run it efficiently. Um, so basically, there's this idea that there is a liberal consensus in America. The liberal consensus refers to the idea that there's Republicans as well as Democrats that accept kind of the new American society that the New Deal ushered in. The New Deal is a permanent part of American society. Now, there are some Republicans we'll hear more about later, especially Barry Goldwater. He's a conservative senator from Arizona. He wants to get rid of the New Deal. He's kind of a libertarian style conservative, I guess you could say, or just a libertarian. He called Eisenhower's version of the New Deal dime store New Deal. Now, Eisenhower, as president, historians have kind of labeled his presidency the hidden hand presidency. Eisenhower's a military man. He's always in charge. He likes to work behind the scenes, though. So publicly, it doesn't always look like he knows what he's doing. Sometimes he looks kind of like a nice old grandpa that's kind of clueless. But Eisenhower is firmly in charge of things going on behind the background. Um, he uses domestic policy to fight the Cold War. The National Interstate and Defense Highway Act gets passed. That basically sets up our interstate highway system. There's a National Defense Education Act. Basically, we're falling behind the Soviets in math and science, so he wants us to catch up. He starts NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So Eisenhower uses kind of domestic issues to help fight the Cold War. And like I said, one of the big fears is that America is falling behind the Soviets in the space race. In 1957, you have two satellites launched into space by the Soviets, Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2. They go up there, they orbit around the Earth. This is seen as a huge setback for the United States. So basically, America pumps more money into science and math education funding so that we can train the next generation of engineers and scientists and mathematicians. So you could maybe say, JFK usually gets the credit for putting the man on the moon, but Eisenhower probably has a big hand in that too because he trained those people or gave the money to train those people to kind of make that possible. So that's a little bit about domestic politics during Truman and Eisenhower's years. We'll kind of keep talking about Cold War issues next time.